Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Abralim ao Vivo, Linguistas Online. I'm Bruno Rocha from Federal University of Minas Gerais, and I'll have the honor and the pleasure to introduce Marc Pell, Bárbara Gili-Fivela, Waldemar Ferreira Netto, and Marcos Martins, who very kindly accepted our invitation to join me in this roundtable dedicated to phonetics, prosody, and pathologies. Abralim ao Vivo, Linguistas Online is a series of events promoted by Abralim, Associação Brasileira de Linguística, in cooperation with CIPL, Comité Internacional Permanent de Linguistes, the ALFAL, Associación de Lingüística y Filología de América Latina, the SAEL, Sociedade Argentina de Estudios Lingüísticos, and the LSA, Linguistic Society of America. In this afternoon, we will have 3 talks, being the first one delivered by Dr. Marc Pell, the second one by Bárbara Gili-Fivela, and the last one by Waldemar Ferreira Netto and Marcos Martins. You can send your questions through the chat on YouTube, and after the presentations have finished, I'll read some of them to the authors. Please post questions, preferably in English, but maybe also in Portuguese and Italian. Dr. Marc Pell is a professor at McGill University. His research investigates how adults communicate their emotions, attitudes, or other social intentions while speaking to better understand the social pragmatic context of spoken language. Much of his work focuses on the effects of the human voice during pragmatic language processing and in social cognition. Behavioral paradigms, acoustic analysis, neuroinvestigative techniques such as ERPs and fMRI, and neuropsychological assessments of brain-damaged adults are being used by him and his group to test these ideas. Now, let's hear from Dr. Pell. Thank you one more time. You can unmute your...
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yeah. Yes, I can. Yeah.
All right. Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Rocha, and to the organizers for this opportunity to be part of the roundtable. It's an honor to be here. It's obviously strange times, and I wondered. I've spent most of my days on Zoom, like many of you. But I still have never done a talk of this type where I'm simply in this room staring at my computer and chatting to myself. And I have no idea how many people are out there. And normally I would, as a speaker, maybe you do this too, I would normally look for someone who's smiling and nodding to me during my talk to help reinforce. And I imagine that everyone thinks I'm, they enjoy what they hear and that I'm saying something clever, but so I'll have to pretend in this case. But I do hope that I can share some of the work we've done on Parkinson's disease and how that affects prosody. We've actually been working on this topic for almost 25 years. So I'd like to give you a little bit of a timeline and walk you through some of our thinking as it evolved over the last 2 decades, to give you an overview perhaps of how Parkinson's affects both the expression and the perception of prosodic information. Okay, just to give you a bit of a structure then. So what I'd like to do with the presentation, I'd first give you a very, very brief overview of Parkinson's and prosody. We will then look at the processing or the receptive aspects of prosodic of prosody and how that is affected in Parkinson's. I'll then turn more to expression and how the patients produce different aspects of prosody. I do focus a lot on emotion in our work, but we will talk about focus and other types of contrasts in the prosodic signal. I'd like to look at the impression that this has on listeners. So if prosody changes in Parkinson's, I'd also like to understand what real impact that has on other people when they're speaking to them. And if I have time at the end, I'll briefly touch on how the Parkinson's patients use prosody in more complex social inferencing and decision making. Okay, so I don't, for this group, I know that I don't need to say these initial, provide this initial information about prosody, but since I'm the first speaker, I'll just do this very quickly. By prosody, of course, we're talking about the suprasegmental aspects of spoken language, which can convey a range of different types of meanings. And they do this over different time domains. And we are talking primarily about differences in pitch, differences in the temporal or rhythmic structure of speaking, the durational properties, and the loudness or intensity of speaking, as well as differences in the spectral composition of the speech signal and differences in energy and spectral, what are perceived as differences in voice quality, for example. And so if you hear something like this,
the rivets jeweled the ceiling.
Okay, so this is not English. It sounds like it could be English, but this is what we call a pseudo utterance. And there's different types of information. I played this because we use this type of stimulus a lot in our research, a pseudo utterance where you need to use the prosodic information. You can't use the linguistic content to derive certain meanings, but you can use the prosodic structure to derive the meaning. And there are different types of meanings that you might have heard in an utterance like that. So you might have heard differences in syllable stress, which could refer to lexical or maybe pragmatic, the focused pragmatic focus or lexical stress in different languages. You probably heard emotional information. I hope that you got a sense that this person was maybe angry or frustrated. And if this was put into a proper context, you might also be able to evaluate different types of social information or socio-emotional, pragmatically relevant information, such as the person's stance. Maybe they have a negative or a positive stance towards the listener, if that were put into a context. So this just emphasizes there are different types of meanings that we routinely derive from prosody. And these are were very much of interest to us in the context of Parkinson's. So let me talk then a little bit about Parkinson's. So this is a neurodegenerative disorder that affects mostly people from middle age on. So middle-aged and older adults tend to develop the disease, and it's a progressive disease. It begins in the middle of the brain in a subcortical structure and affects the dopamine brain system. So it begins with the loss of dopamine producing neurons in the substantia nigra, this structure here. I didn't realize I could use my mouse as a pointer, so that's ideal. But as dopamine is depleted in this part of the brain, what it does is it progressively affects other parts of the brain and leads to a very heterogeneous clinical presentation over time. So it affects circuitry or neural pathways that to other parts of the midbrain and the basal ganglia, which are very important gray matter structures that are involved in motor and cognitive functions, and progressively affects the cerebral cortex and all of the higher cognitive cortical functions of the cortex. And in particular, it can lead to disruption of the frontal lobes. And there are also circuits or loops, what have been described as loops from the basal ganglia, these midbrain structures, to the cortex, which then loop back down and help in certain aspects of motor and cognitive performance. And so what happens in the patients as they lose brain dopamine and lose neurons that produce the dopamine, there's a progressive impairment of functions, which is quite different in different patients and evolves over time. So any description of how Parkinson's affects prosody or more complex aspects of communication is not an easy one. There's very different profiles across patients. But this is the basic, this is the basic mechanism that we need to keep in mind. And of course, we know the hallmark signs of Parkinson's, which are because the basal ganglia are involved in the extrapyramidal motor system. So the system that facilitates voluntary movement and the coordination of movement. We, of course, know that Parkinson's is associated with motor disorders, such as difficulties, slowness of movement or rigidity of movement, changes in posture and gait and walking and so forth. This is well known. And in fact, Parkinson's was described almost purely as a motor disease for many, many decades, which we know now is not true. Parkinson's, in addition to producing motor disturbance, has very pervasive impacts on cognition and communication. And in fact, most Parkinson's patients, when they are diagnosed, will have some type of mild cognitive impairment, and most will progress to full dementia over the course of the disease. So we need to keep both of these in mind, and of course, this informs how we understand communication and prosodic abilities in the disease. All right, so what do we know then about communication? So in terms of expression, so the source of the expressive difficulties and the source of the comprehension difficulties in this disease are different. There is a different explanation for this. So in terms of expression, as I say, Parkinson's has long been associated with motor problems. So the expressive difficulties have been recognized for a long time. So we know that it's associated with reductions in facial movements. So they tend to have a masked face, which of course affects interpersonal communication in a very profound way. But more important to us here, it's long been known for over a century that there is a reduced physiological support for speech. So there is a particular type of dysarthria that is associated with Parkinson's, which is called hypokinetic dysarthria. In general, if you listen to them, you will notice they have a reduced pitch and pitch variation. They have reduced loudness and loudness variation. So these often get called mono-pitch and mono-loudness. They have difficulties controlling the rate of speech and articulation, and they have different voice qualities that are produced because of the difficulty with coordination. So the Parkinsonian voice has been, and changes to the voice, the speaking voice, are well documented. And for a long time, people focused on speech intelligibility. So in general, the patients do have reduced intelligibility of their speech. But the question that I asked with some of this research is, how do these particular deficits affect the patient's ability to communicate specific types of prosodic contrasts or information in speech? So we know that their voices change, but how does that affect, that may not affect all types of prosodic information that we're trying to express in language or with each other? So we wanted to look at that. On the comprehension side, comprehension difficulties are not due to the breakdown in the motor system or the motor circuitry. Rather, they are caused, sort of giving the punchline here, they are caused by the progressive effects of the degeneration on the cortex, and sort of a disconnection of the pathways to the cortex. And so, as I say, there are a number of cognitive, Parkinson's affects all areas of cognition to some extent. That means attention, memory, language. It doesn't produce an aphasia or a classic linguistic disturbance. That is not associated with Parkinson's, but it does affect language in certain ways, and certainly different types of social functions and executive functions. So if you look at the literature, they often have difficulties with working memory. They have difficulties with so-called executive functions or cognitive control. And so the question then is how these types of cognitive issues might impact on prosodic processing. Or perhaps there is some reason that prosodic processing could be directly affected by the course of the disease. So when we started the work, that wasn't really studied very much. There was a bit of a hint in a few sort of random studies in the 80s and early 90s that maybe Parkinson's affects receptive aspects of prosody, but really it hadn't been studied too much. So that's where we'll begin then, in sort of me recounting our investigations along this line. Is everyone still there? Everyone's okay? I can't see you, but if I see a single nod, I'm happy. Okay, perfect. All right, so let's look at comprehension. As I say, we did an early study. This was actually a side project I did during my PhD, and it ended up leading me to something that I was working on for many years. And what we did is we just wanted to know how does Parkinson's affect the ability to recognize prosodic meanings. And we studied 12 patients, so PD is Parkinson's, and I often use HCs for healthy controls. These are always age-matched controls. We just studied two groups of people, one with and without Parkinson's. We had them do different types of tasks. They had to discriminate words, compound words that differed in terms of stress patterns. They had to discriminate intonation patterns, like questions or statements, and they had to categorize emotions. So we did this, and we used two different conditions. We used our so-called pseudo utterances, where they needed to rely on the prosodic information, and we used ones that had additional semantic content that you could use. So you could derive the emotional meaning, for example, from "I didn't make the team." If that was said in a sad voice, you could probably use the semantic information to make the to recognize the emotion. What we found then was that the patients did selectively poor in only the prosodic conditions. So if they were asked to recognize the emotions, they could do this if they could use the semantic context, but not when they had to rely only on the prosodic cues. So this was work from '96, which seemed to verify some initial reports that had come out and gave the sense they didn't have problems discriminating contours. They didn't have problems discriminating phonemic stress pairs. So it seemed to be a difficulty with sort of a more utterance level prosodic information, and perhaps mapping these vocal expressions that refer to emotions onto their meanings was our explanation at the beginning. But we knew we needed to look further at this. So that's what we did. So the next step was then to do a much more comprehensive survey of emotional processing. So here we started to focus increasingly on the emotion aspect. And here we recruited 21 patients and 21 controls, and we wanted them to do both comprehension and expressive tasks. So I'll be describing a number of studies that draw on this same sample. I wanted to be sure that it was something particular to prosody and not to other channels that could convey emotions. So we also had them recognize emotions in the face. We had different types of processing. Sometimes they had to name the emotion. Sometimes they had to do more graded judgments using rating scales. And we had 5 different emotions that we were focusing on at the time. And I'll just do this on one slide. We have a number of studies, but I just want to emphasize some features of the patients that we tend to study. So they tend to be average in their 60s. We choose people who are in their mild to moderate stages of the disease in terms of the motor severity. So they're not very advanced. They're not severely impaired in terms of their motor scores. They are patients who tend not to be depressed, and we choose patients who are not demented. So we screen to make sure that they will have cognitive changes, and we do a background. You can see at the bottom here, we tend to do a whole battery of background cognitive tests to look at how that could refer to their prosodic abilities. For example, in this particular sample of patients, they are, when we look at memory and perception and planning and different types of executive functions, they had showed a reduction in working memory, verbal working memory, but otherwise they were very similar to healthy controls. Okay, and the other point that I'll just make once is that our patients, when we test them, almost all patients are optimally medicated. Okay, so we got this sample and we wanted to go ahead and understand more about the prosodic processing. So we had 3 different conditions. 2 were the same as the previous study that I talked about. So we had a so-called prosody only condition where they needed to recognize the emotion based only on prosody. We had one where they could also use the linguistic information to help them understand the emotion. I think I can play. You've already heard one, but let's try this again. Let's keep us all awake.
I nested the flugs. I nested the flugs. I nested the flugs.
Okay, so I don't know if you can tell what emotions those are, but they are different. And so that's an example of the pseudo utterances again. We had faces. They looked like this. So all of the same emotions they had to recognize in the face through static faces. And what did we find? So again, we find that in terms of face, they were pretty much just like the controls. So the controls are in the lighter purple here. Emotion recognition from the face was unimpaired. And although there's a light decrease when they had these sort of prosody and the semantic information, this was not significant. The only impairment was found when they had to use prosody. Again, it seemed like prosody was a particular area of difficulty at least in their ability to recognize the emotions and to use this sort of more extended utterance level prosody to understand, to map that onto meaning. So this seemed to fit with the other work that we had done. But we wanted to go further. So our next step was, and we were aware that there could be difficulties in the ability to use prosody and to map it onto linguistic labels and so forth. These are more complex types of tasks, these forced choice tasks. So in the next study, we wanted to look at whether the patients could, if they were impaired to recognize the emotions, were they still sensitive to certain affective features within the same stimuli? So for example, could they rate the arousal level of the speaker or the valence, the inherent pleasantness of the signal? Arousal and valence are the 2 basic affective dimensions that one would look at. And so we wanted to determine this, try to get more at the source of their problems. So here we recruited a different group. We had, again, a classic categorization forced choice task like we did before several times, but we also had these ratings tasks, and we expanded it now to 7 emotions. We wanted to consider more emotions. And this is just a quick look at the recognition data, which again tells us the same thing. They had problems when they had to recognize emotions. Now it's 7 different emotions, but they had to recognize them based only on prosody. This is where they had the problem. If they could use language or linguistic cues, they're much better. So if you tell them if someone says how they're feeling, or they provide a very explicit context for that, they seem to be able to recognize that very well. What happens in terms of their sensitivity to these sort of the affective dimensions of the stimuli? So here we have the intensity on the top, and we have the valence on the bottom. In terms of the intensity, so they're using a rating scale, and they're from 1 to 7, and they have to say how aroused or how intense is the emotion. And of course, emotions naturally vary in terms of their underlying arousal. You can see that, for example, fear and anger are much higher than sadness, which is more of a depressed sadness, and happiness and so forth. The Parkinson's patients were were just as sensitive to these distinctions as the controls. They showed no difference. So they were sensitive to the underlying arousal of the speaker when they listened to the voice. But in terms of valence, we found differences. In particular, for negative emotions, we have three sort of more aversive emotions: anger, disgust, and fear. And here we saw significant differences. So the patients showed sort of abnormalities in their sensitivity to negative emotions when they listened to these stimuli. So this started to add a little bit to our understanding of prosodic processing in PD. We again confirmed that they have problems naming or categorizing the emotion when they have to only use prosodic cues. And they also seem to have a deficit for specific emotions, particularly negative emotions. This is sort of verified by there was a meta-analysis done last year in 2019 that sort of came to this very same conclusion much later on, that this is real, that certain negative emotions and understanding them is a problem for the patients. And we think that this is related to the idea that the circuitry involved in understanding, in processing individual emotions is slightly different. And these particular emotions seem to rely on the basal ganglia and related limbic structures that in fact break down quite early in Parkinson's. So this is something we need to keep in mind, because if the patients are unable to process specific type of information from a prosodic stimulus, of course, this would be a severe handicap in our daily lives. So we now have to think about specific emotions in addition to the idea of prosody being a problem. So just as a quick summary then, prosody processing, the receptive aspects of prosody, is an area of difficulty. We didn't in all of these studies find any specific or strong correlation with perceptual or executive control problems. The disease severity didn't seem to predict this. In fact, many of these patients are very mild or in the early stages, and yet they do have these impairments, which is quite an important point to make, that it's not something that comes late in the disease. We have the idea that negative emotions, particularly disgust, may rely on structures that break down in the disease. And what we argued in these papers was that, in fact, there is some evidence that the basal ganglia may have a broader, more domain general function that is disturbed in this case, which is the ability to, the basal ganglia has been said to be involved in sort of implicit learning and judgments based on implicit learning, based on temporal cue sequences. So the information from the basal ganglia to the cortex in these loops, what the basal ganglia may do is to help to bind temporal cue sequences to support and to enable the extraction of meaning. This may be a cognitive function that is supported by the basal ganglia. And so when we, of course, prosodic information and vocal expressions are inherently dynamic. Meaning is extracted and derived through sequential cues that are processed over time and need to be bound together. And what we argued, and what some more recent work is saying could be an important function of the basal ganglia, is this ability to bind temporal information. So that is the basic cognitive function that may underlie prosodic decoding, or the decoding of dynamic nonverbal signals that carry, for example, emotions in particular. So take a very brief 2 breaths to just let that sink in. So dynamic information may be important then. So we started to think about this, and we also wanted to know what helps Parkinson's patients in their daily lives. We wanted to increasingly put these questions, not by presenting isolated signals that isolate particular channels and that are very divorced from what we encounter in our daily life. We wanted to get increasingly more like, wanted to approximate a more ecological context for understanding how Parkinson's function. And so we ran the next study to use only dynamic information. So we had 11 individuals in each group, and here we had videos. So we had speakers that were saying utterances that conveyed particular emotions. And we had the audio-visual information. So they were actually saying pseudo utterances, or they were saying real utterances. And then we broke these videos down into all of their separate channels. So we have the different unimodal, like we have our prosodic channel, our facial channel, and what we call the lexical channel, which is a bit contrived, but in some cases this had to be scrolling sort of scrolling words that were dynamically presented in the unimodal condition. So we had different unimodal conditions. We had a bimodal condition where we combined each channel, and we had then the trimodal condition. We were trying to see if information redundancy could help them to comprehend and correctly recognize the emotions, and where or to determine where problems may be occurring. And we also wanted to start using dynamic facial information, because of course our idea about temporal binding should pertain also to facial information, other types of dynamic representations. So what we found here was that in general, the Parkinsons were impaired. So they did worse than the controls overall. The Parkinson's is in the white, and then the controls are up to the top in this particular graph. So they didn't have any, there was just a general impairment. So they just weren't as good. So we've replicated the idea that they're not as good at recognizing emotions, but it didn't pertain to any particular channel, which is interesting, because this could mean, for example, that dynamic facial information may also be a problem. We were saying earlier it was more prosody, but maybe it's not. Maybe it's more being able to process and decipher dynamic cues. But the other thing that you notice is that as channel availability increased, so did the recognition of the patients in a similar way that it does for neurotypical people or healthy people. So the good thing here is that we see that Parkinson's are better at recognizing the same emotions if they have more ways to more redundant information that they can use. This perhaps makes the process more efficient and helps them to recognize the emotions. So this is, I think, a good thing in terms of understanding how they function in daily life, which may be much better than what we had been suggesting on our earlier tests. Another study where we tried to go even further on this, we used video stimuli from a standardized test that was developed by Scott McDonald and her colleagues in Australia, and it's called the Awareness of Social Inference test. These are videotaped conversations of two people. They're much more complex, but they're much more lifelike. Two people having conversations. There are three different parts. One is a classic emotion recognition test. So you have to say what emotion the speaker is feeling. But the other two get more into sort of the social inferential processing. So you have to use, the participant has to use both verbal and nonverbal information in order to infer whether the speaker is making a literal comment or a sarcastic comment at the end. And in the most complex case, they have to use contextual information. They really have to mentalize. They have to use theory of mind, and they have to mentalize about the speaker and the shared knowledge of the speaker and the hearer to decide whether the speaker is lying or being sarcastic. So it gets much more social and complex. The task then asks about the participant discuss what their beliefs and the feelings of the characters are, and they have to make different types of inferences. So it doesn't isolate prosody, but it starts to tell us something about what happens in real life, we hope. And basically here, if you look at the emotion processing task, there was no impairment. So now our patients are performing just like the controls when they could watch these conversations and try to infer the emotion. So again, this probably tells us that emotion processing is difficult when it's in more cognitively or more constrained, or it's or isolated conditions, or maybe more cognitively complex tasks. The patients also could determine whether the speaker was being literal, but if you see down here, once they started to have to do more complex mentalizing, they started to have problems. And we found that this correlated very strongly with their working memory capacity. So if you go to our early studies where we just found prosodic problems, we never found a link between working memory and basic cognitive resources in the patients. But when you start to look in more social contexts, more pragmatic contexts, we see a very clear correlation between the individual's cognitive capacity, as estimated by such things as working memory or verbal fluency, often is a correlator. These become predictors of how they probably perform in these more complex social tasks that involve prosody and other types of nonverbal cues. So this is hopefully gives a strong impression then that prosody is an area of concern that is affected in different ways by Parkinson's disease. But there are also conditions that suggest that Parkinson's patients probably perform better in certain contexts where they have explicit verbal information or generally redundant information that helps them to understand what meanings are being expressed. Okay. I'm being a bit verbose, I think, so I'm going to try to move a bit faster. Let's turn to expression. So we said that people have long known that the prosodic voice is different. They speak differently. They have problems with in modulating, in particular, and the pitch and loudness and producing the normal expressivity or variability in speech. How does this affect how does this affect the way they can communicate specific types of contrast? So it's very possible that having, if you can't vary your pitch, you might still be able to very successfully convey certain types of information, but not others. So we wanted to look at this. We wanted to quickly verify the acoustic information, the acoustic changes in patients, but also look at how that limits or may limit their ability to express certain emotions or things, other contrasts such as differences in focus or the new, marking new information in an utterance. So that was our first question. How does that affect? And then we wanted to look at the impact on listeners in a broader sense. So we wanted to know what problems do listeners have when they listen to Parkinson's patients, and what other types of social impressions do they derive about the patients, which could be affecting their social lives and their perceived competence as communicators. Okay, so I'll try to move fast. I'm sorry I can't, hopefully I won't skip over any important details, but we could come back to it later. So we first had them read or say sentences. So here we told them, we basically had a set of sentences and we told them, please express these in a certain way, like as if you're, so that the listener thinks you're angry, or so the listener knows that you're focusing or emphasizing a certain word. So we had you could say the girl jumped on the bed instead of the boy. So they have the girl jumped on the bed, or the girl jumped on the bed instead of jumped on the couch. In the emotion task, they used sort of neutral-ish sentences that could be expressed in different emotions. Then we analyzed these acoustically. We looked at classic sort of pitch, loudness, and durational characteristics. And in this one study, it's just to confirm what we suspected, that we found a decrease in loudness for all the different emotions. So no matter what emotion they're expressing, they tend to have a softer voice, and they had less pitch variation than the control participants, but only for certain emotions where you expect a large amount of pitch variation. So happy and surprised in ones where you expect there's a large sort of expressive range. They couldn't do this. They had a smaller range, whereas others, they showed a very similar range to the control participants. So maybe their motor limitations aren't affecting everything. Here's just an example. This is a control participant.
They found it in the room.
And this is a Parkinson participant.
They found it in the room.
Okay, so this is trying to be happy. All right, so we see that there are documented acoustic changes. How does that affect listeners? What do they hear and what can they recognize when they listen to these? So we got 20 people who did not know the patient's status. So they heard the control and the patient's. They didn't know that this was a study about Parkinson's. They had to either listen to the utterances to determine where the emphasis was being placed. So what information was being emphasized. In the emotion task, they had to recognize the emotion. And then once they recognized the emotion, they had to say how intense the emotion was. So what we found was that in overall, listeners are less accurate in recognizing the prosodic meanings that are being conveyed by the Parkinson's patients. So the patients were not as good at effectively communicating the meanings that they intended. This was overall. If you look at focus or emphasis, the listeners tended to say none. They didn't hear any emphasis, which of course is a problem if you're trying to pragmatically mark new information to the listener. In terms of emotions, they much more frequently said that the Parkinson patient was neutral, that they didn't have any emotion. And when they recognized the emotion, even if they correctly recognized the emotion that the patient was conveying, they rated it as less intense portrayal of emotion than the controls. So even if they knew that they meant to be disgusted, it was a less intense portrayal of disgust. So it may not have been what the patient actually intended. And we saw a specific difficulty with anger. So the listeners could not hear anger in the patient's voice. And in fact, we went back to the literature and we found several examples of that specific problem. So quite possibly the acoustic cues that listeners expect in the context of anger just are not there for these patients. So this is starting to tell us what listeners actually hear and the types of communicative problems that patients may experience. What are some broader social implications, though? There are other things that could happen in terms of the way their voice is impacting on other people, not just the specific meanings. Of course, the voice gives an insight into our character and who we are, and makes us hopefully a desirable social partner. It's part of the glue of social interactions. And so we wanted to take this another step further because some early reports had said that people with Parkinson's are rated as very cold, as unlikable, as unhappy, anxious, these types of very negative social attributions, which would be very harmful for maintaining and creating social bonds. And so this is the idea that just because they speak a certain way, Parkinson's patients may be viewed as less socially competent and undesirable as social partners. And so we wanted to look at this. How am I doing for time, Bruno? I got 5 minutes or so?
Yes, go on.
Okay. So here we wanted to get a discourse sample. So we used this classic image from the discourse comprehension test. And we had people tell the story, what is happening in the picture, because we wanted a more extended discourse sample that we could play to listeners, and they could rate it. They could evaluate it in various ways. So don't have time to play them both, but I'll let you listen a bit to the Parkinson's patient describing this picture.
Looks like a cat is up a tree, kind of stuck up a tree, and the father might have been trying to reach the cat with the ladder. The ladder's fallen down. The father's stuck up the tree as well.
Okay, so you get the point there. So we had these discourse samples. We played these to 30 naive listeners, and we did it in two different contexts. In the first context, we wanted them to judge the story. So some people had said, oh, that Parkinson's may be viewed as less linguistically competent. And of course, that could contribute to a sense of social incompetence. We wanted to be able to tease this apart. So the first time they judged, or one time, they judged various aspects of the story structure, their ability to tell the discourse in terms of its coherence, level of detail, and so forth. Okay, this would give us a sense of whether their linguistic competence. On a second occasion, they heard the same one and they judged the speaker. So characteristics of the speaker, so whether they sound anxious or happy or friendly, or they're likable, intelligent, and so forth, interested. Okay, so more social features. What did we find?
Firemen are coming to.
So in terms of their linguistic competence, basically we see no major concern. So there are no differences here in terms of being coherent, comprehensible, easy to follow. There are no differences except for actually detail. The Parkinson's patients gave less detail. I think without even hearing one of the control participants, I think you could get a sense from the production I played. In fact, I would say the level of detail was actually more appropriate with the patients. We found that our controls actually said too much or went on and gave extraneous details. But the main conclusion I'd say here is that we found no strong evidence that they had problems telling a well-structured story that was easy to follow and comprehensible and captured what was happening in the picture. So it's not a question of linguistic competence. What about their social competence? Now they're rating the speaker. I've split this up. So there were 3 scales where they were not different from controls. They actually were viewed as just as likable, as relaxed. What they failed to, where their evaluations differed was along these different scales. So the patients were viewed as less friendly, as less happy, less interested, and involved. They were actually rated as more intelligent. In this case, we have another study where it was the opposite. But I think that these issues of the patients being viewed as less interested and involved and friendly are very critical ones, because these are the types of, a negative evaluation along these dimensions would probably be very harmful in terms of someone wanting to continue to interact with an individual. If you feel that they're not interested, if you are talking to them and you have the impression they're not interested or involved in the conversation, there will be very little incentive for people to continue to maintain or strike up conversations or maintain interactions with those people. And so there are very strong negative impressions of Parkinson's individuals being formed simply based on the way they're speaking and the way that the listener is evaluating and interpreting them socially, which I think is very important. And we've replicated this in a 2017 study. I can't show you this, but we actually had age peers. In this study, they're young people that are evaluating them. In another study, we had a different methodology. We had age-matched peers, so older people judging them to see if that was different. And they came to the same types of conclusions. The patients sounded less interested, less involved, and in some cases were viewed as less likable. And we even had them say, would you want to continue a meaningful relationship with this person? And they will say no. They will be, the patients are rated as uniformly lower than age-matched controls. So I think that this emphasizes the really important social implications of speaking with Parkinson's disease. And I think that this is one of the valuable points that comes out of the research. So just in a quick summary then, the patients do have difficulties due to their changes in their voice. They have difficulties conveying emotions, especially anger, it seems, in a salient manner, differences in focus. They often sound neutral or that they're not emphasizing particular words. And they are generally linguistically competent, but they are viewed as socially undesirable and are evaluated negatively along several dimensions, which do not reflect their personality or the way they are feeling at that moment. These are attributions that are made by the listener based on characteristics in their voice. And I think that that's really important and has an enormous impact on the patients in their daily lives. So to put everything together then, I hope that I've made the case that that Parkinson's disease is associated with both expressive and receptive difficulties that affect prosody. And as I mentioned earlier, this is different in every individual patient, and it reflects the way that the disease evolves in that individual and the way it's impacting on different brain systems as the disease progresses. And this definitely has an effect on their social abilities and their perceived social competence. I think that's something we need to learn more about because there may be ways to try to counteract those impressions that people have of the patients. And we need to look carefully at how cognitive changes affect not only prosodic processing, but more generally pragmatic processing. So social pragmatics is something that is susceptible to the cognitive changes in the disease. And so we can go well beyond how prosodic information is being used in pragmatic context. If you look at a variety of different pragmatic phenomena, you will, I think we will see that that the patients, as the disease progresses, that they have increasing difficulties in terms of their pragmatic language use. One final word, where do we go next? Well, we want to know we know that prosody can be a difficulty. Prosody gets used in a variety of ways. So our next step is, how do people use prosody in different types of decision making? So for example, we've learned that if someone speaks in a confident way, we tend to trust them more. And so one way that we can look at how the patients use prosody in a social interactive context is, for example, using the trust game, we can see if can decipher prosodic cues to confidence and use that. They may use that as a basis for showing trust in players in a social interactive game. And we can again try to get at their use of prosody in a context that much more closely reflects daily life. So this is the work of my postdoc Jonathan Caballero, who's working on this now. So thank you very much. I'm sorry I went a bit late, but I appreciate your attention. This is our lower campus. I haven't seen it in months because of the lockdown, but I'm sure it looks like that.
Thank you very much, Professor Pell, for this very exciting talk. I'd like to remember the public that after all the talks, I'll read the questions to the authors. The next talk will be delivered by Dr. Barbara Gili-Fivela, who is currently professor at Università del Salento and president of the Italian Association for Speech Sciences, Associazione Italiana Scienze della Voce, AISD, and vice president of the Interdisciplinary Speech and Language Research Center. Dr. Gili-Fivela has authored several works on the following themes: production and perception of intonation, articulatory features of segmental and suprasegmental phenomenon, phonetics and phonology of foreign language learning, and phonetics and phonology in pathological speech. So now let's hear from Gili-Fivela. Thank you.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me, and I'm really happy to participate in this roundtable. Well, the aim of my talk is to address the contribution of phonetics and phonology to the analysis of motor speech disorders, with specific attention to the hypokinetic dysarthria in Parkinson's disease. So as I got the information that the audience could be quite heterogeneous, I decided to start with an introduction. So I hope you don't find it too much boring. But basically the talk is divided in two parts. So in the first part, I will briefly recall the main phonetics and phonological issues which are relevant to the understanding of the talk. And then I offer an overview of the main motor speech disorders and of some information provided by phonetics and phonological analysis that may be useful. Specific attention will be devoted to the added value of collecting and analyzing articulatory data besides the auditory and acoustic ones. And further, I will mention two phonological frameworks for the analysis of phonetic data regarding segments and prosody, especially intonation. That is, I will briefly sketch the main aspects of articulatory phonology and of the auto-segmental metrical framework. In the second part of the talk, I summarize findings of some investigations on hypokinetic dysarthria, some works that we did on Italian, on the Italian segmental and prosodic aspects, and they will show how taking both phonetics and phonology into account, hopefully they will show it, within a laboratory phonology perspective helps or may help in understanding the complex interplay between the effort in producing linguistic information and the limits due to impairment. So when we analyze speech in phonetic terms, we consider the way speech is produced, it is perceived, and also the acoustic characteristics of the speech signal. That is the characteristics of the wave that moves from the speaker to the hearer. So in phonetics, we investigate these phases, focusing attention on the physical characteristics. And this holds true both for simple single sounds and for that mean vowels and consonants, and also for prosodic characteristics, that is the sound features that characterize more than one single phone. So investigating the anatomy and physiology of the vocal apparatus within the articulatory phonetics, we find out how to define the main articulatory characteristics of phones. For instance, we use terms such as bilabial plosive and unvoiced to refer to p, pointing out that we realize it without involving vocal fold vibration and allowing the air coming out from the lungs to freely go through the larynx and the pharynx, to be constrained within the oral cavity because of the closure due to the movement of the lips. And in fact, the lips get in touch and completely close the vocal tract, and it is basically the release of such bilabial closure that allows the air to abruptly leave the mouth and allow us to produce a P sound. So we can then investigate the sound wave produced by the speaker, and by means of the acoustic analysis of the sound wave, we can get a lot of information on both the acoustic characteristics of the wave and on the position of the articulators during the speech production.
Sorry.
Yep.
You're not sharing your screen. I don't know if you were supposed to share it.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, yeah.
I thought I shared it before starting.
Yes, you shared before starting, but then you...
Here we are. Okay.
Yes. I'm really sorry.
No, don't worry. I'm sorry, actually. So, can you see?
Just just a moment. Yes, now we can see it.
Yeah, okay. So I think I'll keep going because otherwise it can be quite late. But anyway, there were not like crucial information in the screen earlier than this. So I was saying that basically acoustic investigations are now basically standard in phonetics and not only in phonetics. And high quality public domain software is available and the methodology is established and well known. So on the bottom of the slide, you see a figure on the information which usually represents the starting point of acoustic investigation. So from top to bottom, you see the waveform, a spectrogram with an overlaid pitch track, the blue track, and the word level transcription. In this case, it is an Italian utterance. So starting from this type of representation, we can perform measurements regarding segments in order to know, for instance, the duration and the formal values of a vowel, let's say, which can be then related to articulatory information, such as the duration of the articulation as a whole, or the tongue position in terms of the height or the advancement of the tongue in the oral cavity. Or we can measure prosodic parameters, such as the duration of the syllable or the fundamental frequency values reached for a specific tonal target. For instance, in terms of its height or its alignment, that is the synchronization with respect to the syllable, let's say. So further, we can then relate this information to articulatory events, such as the production of prosodic units and vocal fold activity. So turning to phonology, we can work on the inventory of phonemes of a specific language, that is finding out which phones actually represent an implementation of phonemes, that is which phones are actually implementation of distinctive elements in the language. So for instance, we can find out that in Italian, A and E are different phonemes, as the presence of one or the other allows to produce words with different meanings, such as data, date, and dita, fingers. There are a number of frameworks we can use to elaborate on the phonological system, but actually what's important here, because I think that the previous knowledge was already shared, is that we can also work on the phonology of intonation. That is, we can investigate, for instance, the phonological inventory of tonal events in a specific language, and say we can consider in utterances such as those shown here, and I can play the sample for you. In one case, which is represented on the left, we have a statement, and the other case on the right, we have a question. So in investigating those sentences, we can, for instance, find out what tonal element is crucial in conveying the difference between a statement and a question interpretation. So therefore, we can describe which element in the intonation contour conveys linguistic information, such as the sentence modality, if it's just one element, of course. So, for instance, the autosegmental metricon framework allows for a phonological description of intonation and related prosodic events, as well as for the investigation of the implementation of phonological events in terms of their phonetic realization. The phonological units in this case are tone targets, which may be part of pitch accents or edge tones, and the former are prominence landing events, which may be mono or bitonal, depending on the number of targets. You see high star or low plus high star, where the star indicates the association with the starred syllable. As for the edge tones, they rather signal phrase boundaries of different levels in the prosodic hierarchy. But phonetic characteristics of the implementation of such phonological events can be investigated both in terms of the temporal alignment, as I already mentioned, so the synchronization with respect to segments, as well as in terms of the scaling. And of course, this can be done also with respect to articulatory data, so not only with respect to acoustics. So for instance, I may be interested in investigating the alignment with the end of the syllable in articulatory terms. In this case, I was just showing the alignment in acoustic terms. So what about articulatory data? Well, we can collect various types of data on the articulators' movements, and articulatory data and the related equipments are less widespread than acoustic ones in phonetic laboratories. However, the methodology is established and well known in the case of articulatory investigation too. And they offer relevant information, for instance, with respect to motor speech disorders. So due to time constraint, I cannot go through all the options listed here, but I will focus on electromagnetic articulography because I will then present some data which we collected with this methodology and this instrument. In order to collect data on the position of some sensors within the magnetic field itself. And one of such systems is the AG501, the one you can see here, for instance. So basically, the system works thanks to 9 transmitter coils, which are inside the 3 blue arms that you can see in the picture, right on the top of the subject who is sitting. So the subject has to be seated with his head under the coils within the magnetic field created by the transmitter coils, and has some sensors glued on his internal and external articulators. Here the sensors are on the upper and lower lip, and 2 sensors are on the tongue. So basically the system allows to determine the position of the sensors in time with respect to the magnetic field, that it allows to track the movement along different axes of specific points on the lips and on the tongue. And notice that the audio signal is always simultaneously recorded, so that, for instance, in this case, we have the speech waveform on the top, and we may analyze it in relation with the speech gesture that here corresponds to the tongue tip movement in the production of a word in Italian that is vince. Here you get a clue on the type of information which is available. So if you look at the plot, you see from the top to bottom the waveform. That is the speech signal where acoustic vowels and consonants, for instance, may be segmented and highlighted. And then 2 panels where black tracks are plotted and 2 where green tracks are plotted. The black tracks, for instance, represent the velocity and position in time of the tongue dorsum sensor, while the green tracks represent the velocity and position of the lower lip sensors. So we can obtain data on various axes. So for instance, we can obtain data on the vertical displacement or on the horizontal, for instance, on the front-back dimension. So it is possible to perform various types of measures. We can, for instance, perform a measure of the latency between the target on the position plot, which are always identified on the basis of the velocity plot. And then it is also possible to measure the amplitude of the sensor movements, or importantly, it is also possible to perform measurements regarding the phasing between 2 different gestures. So kinematic and dynamic data can be a good alternative to traditional explanation when framed within an appropriate related theoretical frameworks. And one of such frameworks is articulatory phonology, according to which the main unit of linguistic description is also the main unit in terms of motor control for linguistic purposes. So this unit is the articulatory gesture. So the gesture has the status of phonological unit within this framework and is conceived as a coordinative structure. And so speech is described as the results of a coordinated set of movements. So of course I have to be quick, but I can go back on this later if you want. However, in articulatory phonology, the gesture is considered as both a unit of action and a unit of information. The formula unit of action, going back to the description in Raman and Goldstein 2000, is a gesture, has a dynamic system that guides the coordination of a set of multiple articulators and muscles in the formation of a vocal tract constriction. And a unit of information as individual gesture may be used to distinguish or contrast utterances from one another. So basically, articulators and goals are involved in the creation and release of constrictions in the vocal tract. And the approach is dynamic as it describes a system that changes over time.
So here you can see the model by Goldstein et al. In 2006, that is articulators are articulators such as the lips, the tongue, the glottis, and constriction goals are, for instance, the alveolar ridge, the palate, and the pharynx. So according to Kent, 97, this may be very useful because dynamic models of articulatory production may explain better the characteristic phenomena in general of speech motor disorders, because very often they cannot be really well dealt with by most existing phonological frameworks, because the issues of motor controls, they fall outside their scope. So what about the investigation of motor speech disorders? So we are interested in disorders and pathologies that imply relevant disturbances in speech articulation. Well, it is very difficult to clearly tell apart the disorders and pathologies of language, but the most interesting disorders, given our interests in speech articulation, are related to, for instance, the inability or the altered ability to articulate phones and words due to pathology of the organs, or the inability to voluntarily perform articulatory gestures, or due to the presence also of general errors and problems in the articulation due to brain alteration or physical states. So we will basically focus on the latter group, which does not imply necessarily, alteration of the organs involved in speech articulation, but we still have to distinguish different kinds of disorders, and we do it by considering those involving cognition or not, at least on a theoretical basis, as we already heard from Marc Pell, that with the progression of the disease, then there may be like more complicated pictures that we have to face. So very quickly, aphasias, for instance, do involve cognition, and they are due to damages to the main area deputed to language. They can consist in patient's production or comprehension deficits, depending on the areas where the lesion is. There are various forms. We can have patients who can produce few recognizable words and understand little or no spoken language. And we can, on the other side, have the inability to supply just words naming, like mainly nouns and verbs. However, another class of speech disorder that do not necessarily involve cognition is that of those pathologies entailing the motor aspects of speech, such as apraxia and dysarthria. So apraxial speech is a motor speech disorder that can occur in the absence of aphasia or dysarthria, though its symptoms often co-occur or overlap with those caused by aphasia and dysarthria. It may be due to various lesions and it may show many subtypes. So it has been defined in various ways. I'm not going through all of them, but here I just want to highlight that Darley defined it as a disorder of motor speech programming manifested primarily by errors in articulation. So programming is at issue here. I have another slide on apraxia, but I'm going to skip it because otherwise it's going to be long, but we can go back to that later if you want. While turning to dysarthria, which is more focused for this talk, dysarthria is due to a neurological damage, again, that can depend on several different causes, such as neurodegenerative pathologies as Parkinson disease, but also other like lesions and other toxic or metabolic causes. The impairment in this case regards the muscle strength, the tone, the range of motion, and the coordination. So we'll see more in details later, which is the impact on segments and prosody. However, consider that dysarthria can affect phonation, definitely articulation and prosody. So there are apparently many similarities with other symptoms of apraxia of speech, for instance. However, the errors in dysarthric speech are usually consistent and predictable,
while the errors in apraxia of speech tend to be highly irregular. And indeed, motor programming models consider dysarthrias as due to a deficit at the end stage of execution stage of speech production that is involving articulation, while apraxia of speech is often regarded as a more intermediate level problem. So various types of dysarthria are defined by a perceptual classification, for instance, by Darley in Italy in 1975. They are associated to specific neurological damages and cause different effects on human movements. You can see the table here. We will see later some investigation on the hypokinetic dysarthria, since it is usually attributed to Parkinson's disease. So please keep this in mind. But before this, I'd like to see with you why we should insist on phonetics and phonology in investigating speech pathologies. And the reasons is that for many decades, the description, the explanation, and the rehabilitation of various motor speech disorders have been carried out on data derived from phonetic transcriptions, which are based on subjective perception and acoustic analysis. However, these methods reveal limitation, for instance, limitation in description, and this is due to the subjectivity and the, to a certain extent, arbitrariness of the evaluation stemming from the auditory perception, and in the absence also of a two-way relation between acoustic and articulatory data. Other limits regard the explanation, as limits consist firstly in the opacity introduced by the relative distance between the more or less central cause of the pathology and the measured acoustic and perceptual events which originate at the periphery of the speech production system. And further, as I tried to suggest earlier, we may have overcrossed problems concerning the inadequacy of phonetic phonological theories, which may be now suitable to explain motor events of an intrinsically dynamic nature. And finally, other limits regard rehabilitation, as well, we often face the inability to provide an adequate articulatory feedback to the patient during rehabilitation. While using articulatory data, it is possible to provide an articulatory feedback. So basically, as Greco in 1992 already pointed out, it is useful to integrate traditional methods with articulatory data, as they offer a reliable and exhaustive quantity and quality of data about the movements of the articulatory organs. And these data are crucial for an accurate description of the articulatory effects of pathology in terms of both the description of the gesture and the physical condition of the gesture. And further, kinematic data may also be used to provide an articulatory feedback, as I already mentioned, to patients during rehabilitation. So let's now turn to our work on hypokinetic dysarthria in Italian speakers. So this is definitely a teamwork. So I have to thank all the members of the lab who collaborated in the past years to this line of research. Well, as we already heard from the previous speaker, one specific type of dysarthria is hypokinetic dysarthria, and many Parkinson's disease speakers basically develop hypokinetic dysarthria during their illness. And this specific type of dysarthria, as already mentioned, is characterized by hypokinesia and also bradykinesia, that is a reduction in the amplitude and speed of movements. So concerning segmental features, a reduction is usually reported as for both the vowel acoustic space and the amplitude of speech gestures. However, results are not always consistent, especially as for the amplitude of gestures, as a greater amplitude in Parkinson's speech gestures is reported in some kinematic investigations. For instance, results on Italian show that this can be the case for specific axes. So for instance, we could find that there is a reduced amplitude in lower lip vertical displacement, but rather we could find an increased amplitude on the tongue dorsum gesture on the front-back dimension. Finally, duration of movement is also expected not to change much at least, or it can decrease, but the reduction of amplitude and velocity is not proportional. As far as the prosodic features, you already heard from Marc Pell, but I mean, very quickly, well, we often talk about monotonous and monolaudant speech, and with small variations in pitch, range, and voice intensity. So basically, these features can vary a lot, also depending on the task, and definitely they can vary depending on the disease severity. So what I'm talking to you of is, I mean, there are two investigations we performed in Italy, two different set of works actually, but one work relates to geminates and in comparison to single-tone consonants. So we are looking at consonants in words like fatto and fato, so fact and faith. There are two different words, of course, in Italian. And another investigation focuses on labialization in vowels. So we consider vowels such as E and U, which are, again, differentiating meanings. So those are like phonemes of Italian. And we will also take a look at prosodic control in short phrases, but we have very preliminary data on that. We were basically trying to answer a set of questions with all those works. So the first investigation, as I said, concerns the geminate and singletons. And we know from previous studies that geminates and singleton, they show different acoustic and articulatory characteristics. So specifically, geminates are acoustically longer, and they are also preceded by a shorter vowels in comparison to singletons. And as for kinematics, we know that geminates show longer and wider gestures in comparison to singletons. So for instance, if we take into account the lips, we've got a wider gesture, wider opening, and also wider closing gesture in geminates rather than in singletons. Thus, we may wonder if the distinction between singleton and geminate consonant, which is useful in linguistic terms in Italian, is preserved by Dysarthria speakers, and if it is, how it is preserved. As for labialization, well, we are interested in labialization because of those inconsistent results I mentioned earlier, because as I said, we could find some gestures that in Italian were basically wider and even longer in Parkinson speech than in control speech. So we decided to investigate vowels he and u that are, yeah, as I said, phonemes of the language, because they differ as for the position of the tongue, as E is a front vowel and U is a back vowel, but they also differ as for the lip rounding and lip protrusion. Because I mean, in U, you've got the lips that are protruded, so there is a movement basically in the front-back dimension. So we know that the acoustic characteristics are due to both the tongue and the lip gesture. So it is interesting to investigate the two gestures so that maybe one gesture may shed light on the other, and also they shed light on the acoustic results, because the acoustic represents the output, of course. Further, those inconsistent results I mentioned earlier, they add up to some inconsistent results regarding the reduction of the vowel acoustic space, and again, the amplitude of speech gestures. So the idea is trying to understand what happens in the front-back displacement in the case more than one articulator is actively at work, that is in the case of EU, because they differ for both the tongue and the lip gestures. As for prosodic control, well, we already know that we have to deal with monotonous and monolaudness speech. And plus, there is no description of prosody in Italian Dysarthria speech so far. So the question arises as to the pitch range characteristics in Dysarthria speech, and importantly, in how the alignment of linguistically relevant event may be affected by Parkinson, in particular Dysarthria in Parkinson's speech. So I will just give you a description of the corpus, because basically it was like very similar across the investigations. We always had disyllables as target words, and depending on the investigation, vowels in the target words could be EU or AE. We had 3 vowels in each target sentence, and we also had initial or intervocalic consonants that could be either voiced or unvoiced by labial stops or nasals. So sample by disyllables are shown in the table. So in the geminate singleton corpus, we got target words such as pipa and pipa, while in the investigation of labialization, for instance, we had target words like pipu and pupi. All these words were inserted in carrier sentences, and in all cases, these sentences were presented as answers to questions eliciting broad focus interpretation. So the speech material is definitely highly controlled, and this is a very limiting characteristics of this type of articulatory investigation. So as for the subject, we analyze the speech produced by mild to severe dysarthric Parkinson speakers, who were 4 or 5, depending on the investigation. They were all from Lecce, which is in the south of Italy, and they were aged between 65 and 80, and enrolled together with matching health control. As for the recordings, we collected acoustic and articulatory data, EMA data in particular. So each speaker was reading the corpus, read the corpus for 7 times at a comfortable speech rate, while articulatory data were recorded by means of 7 sensors. They were glued on the subject. And so as you can see from the picture here, we had 2 sensors on the tongue mid-sagittal plane and 2 sensors on the upper and lower lip vermilion border, and 3 sensors were used for reference, 1 on the nose and 2 behind the ears. So I will go very quickly over the acoustic measures and labeling. But basically, I can play you a sample of our data. And we performed measurements of like segments and segment duration, and also we measure different landmarks, values on the F0 track, as well as latency measurements. For instance, the latency from the F0 peak to the final low, or the latency between the F0 peak and the previous low target. And we also measure the F0 displacement, so the pitch span used for those F0 changes. And we also measure the alignment of the F0 landmark to specific segmental landmarks. So as for articulatory measurements, here as well, we perform different measures. Basically, we're interested in understanding the duration of single gestures, and also the displacement for the single gestures, and then we run statistics that were mixed models. So turning to the results, basically here you can see what we could find out for the geminate singleton investigation. I mean, some of the results. Well, in the box plot here, you can find control production that are plotted on the left and Parkinson productions on the right. The white boxes represent singletons and the gray boxes represent geminates. And as you can see, pathological speakers as well as controls, they differentiated the consonant acoustic duration to convey the singleton geminate distinction. However, pathological subjects always produce slightly shorter consonants. When looking at articulatory data, results show that during Geminats, the release of the duration is greater for both groups. In the case of Geminats, as I said, but pathological speakers' gestures were occurring in a reduced range. Reduction is also found in the lip gesture amplitude, and indeed the box plot here report the amplitude of the lower lip gesture in the opening from the consonant to the following vowel. And basically control productions are again plotted on the left and Parkinson production on the right. White boxes represent again singletons and gray boxes represent geminates. And notice that, however, in this case, the scale on the epsilon axis is negative, so higher boxes actually correspond to smaller values. But what we could find is that increasing values were found from singletons in Parkinson to geminates in controls. But what's interesting is that there was no significant difference. I hope you can see the box plot with the red highlighting. There was no significant difference between control singletons and pathological geminates. So basically values were reduced in Parkinson, or let's say produced the difference between singleton and geminates to a different degree, or they were scaled down, to the extent that there was no significant difference between a geminate for a control and a singleton for a Parkinson. But still the difference was there in between the Parkinson's production. So the linguistic information was maintained. So as for the labialization in vowels, we were of course interested in motor control in the anterior posterior dimension. So let's take a look to the results of the second form and values in acoustic, because they correlate to the length of the vocal tract, and therefore they are correlated to the tongue position on the anterior posterior dimension. So the box plot on the slide shows the F2 values for control subjects, this in white boxes, and for Parkinson, gray boxes, in the case of U on the left and E on the right. And results show, as expected, that F2 values are higher for E than for U. But importantly, an interaction was found between the vowel cycle, that means the types of vowels that were in the sentence, and the population. And specifically, the second form increases from U to E less in Parkinson than in controls. So this is in line with a reduction, this is in line with a reduction of the acoustic space, okay? But what's interesting is that when turning to the articulatory results, as expected, we could find the horizontal movement of the tongue that was affected by the vowel, so the vowel cycle, but basically by the vowel target. And so the gesture from one vowel to the other was different, and we got lower values for U boxes on the left and then for E boxes on the right. But what is relevant here is that the interaction with the population, meaning the pathological or non-pathological subject. Indeed, the plot shows the horizontal displacement in the gesture to the stressed vowel for the control subject, white boxes, and Parkinson speakers, gray boxes, in the gesture to U on the left and to E on the right. And as you can see, the tongue movement is wider in Parkinson than in controls. And these two results are not consistent with those concerning the F2, as we already found in the past, because the result concerning F2 were suggesting a reduction in the vowel space in the case of Parkinson speakers, while in articulatory terms, we could find again this wider movement on the horizontal axis. What was really interesting in this investigation concerned the lip movement, because the lower lip horizontal gesture to the consonant, which is the onset of the accented syllable, was significantly affected by the population factor, meaning the Parkinson or control subject group. And this may shed some light on the issue. So first of all, as you can see in the plot concerning the gesture from the vowel to the consonant, of course, we could find the expected increase in the amplitude in gesture from the U vowel to the consonant, which is then followed by E, in comparison to the amplitude values related to the gesture from the E vowel to the consonant, then followed by U. However, the difference between Parkinson and control values is more relevant for the purpose of this talk. So the factor population turned out to be significant indeed. And in fact, the gesture to the consonant in Parkinson was significantly shorter than in controls. And this is important as it shows that lip gesture was less wide and it could possibly compensate for the more wide gesture of the tongue. So as for pitch, and I'm almost concluding, results regarding pitch range are in line with expectation as Parkinson speakers show a significantly reduced range. The difference is about 16 Hertz in comparison to control, but the difference that are reported in the plot and the box plot that correspond to mean value, they also show that pitch range values in controls are more condensed, so they vary less than the differences in Parkinson's production. While the only difference related to the population regarding the alignment, meaning more linguistic information in our corpus, related basically to the falling accent, so to the distance in between the peak and the final low target, where we could find only a slight interaction between the voicing and the population factor, in that the Parkinson speaker were showing longer latency in the case of voiced consonants. As for the articulatory data, we could only take a look to alignment, not to scaling, of course. Here, I only briefly mentioned the prenuclear, the timing on the prenuclear high target with respect to the articulatory end of the accented syllable. And what is relevant here is that the type of vowels in the sequence slightly interacts with the population factor. And indeed, as you can see in the plot, in the Parkinson data, the gray plot, differently than from controls, the latency slightly increases in syllable with accented E in comparison to accented U. So basically, what I wanted to show you is that besides a general tendency to reduction, for instance, in some acoustic values and gesture amplitude values, as well as pitch values, the analysis showed a more complex picture involving also increased values, possibly related to compensation strategies. And as for the geminate values, they are reduced in Parkinson productions, and because they basically scale down the difference between the singleton and the geminate consonant, but they maintain the difference in their speech. On the other hand, the labialization results clearly show that a reduction was found in acoustic values regarding the second format, which suggests a reduction in the acoustic space used by speakers. However, when looking at the articulatory data, we could find an increase in the amplitude of the front-back tongue gesture, and crucially, results on the reduction of the amplitude in the lip gesture in the front-back dimension related to protrusion. They pointed to the realization of a compensation strategy, as the lip protrusion lowers the acoustic formal values, and probably the tongue wider gesture compensates for this lowering. So thus, in this case, a compensation really looks to be realized. As far as the prosodic parameters are concerned, we could observe the tendency to reduction in Parkinson's speech in line with the literature, for instance, regarding pitch range. But we could also observe a difference between control and Parkinson speakers concerning the acoustic latency between the prenuclear H and the articulatory end of the syllable. These results are too preliminary, of course, to allow for very deep discussion. However, they suggest that there may be an effort to meet a phonological requirement over there. So to conclude, I tried to show that phonetic and phonology, and in particular the collection of a wide set of data, represents an added value in the analysis of motor speech disorders, and in particular hypokinetic dysarthria in Parkinson disease patients. Basically, when looking at the main findings of some investigations on hypokinetic dysarthria in Italian, we could literally see results of measurements suggesting that some reduced values found in speech, and probably some results regarding dysarthric speech in general, may actually be due to a complex interplay of efforts in producing linguistic information, even though there are limits due to the impairment. So all in all, this talk argues in favor of adopting a wider set of data as possible, as wide as possible, in analyzing both phonetics and phonology of pathological speech. However, as you have seen, articulatory investigations are quite heavy from a number of perspectives, and therefore the experiments regard a limited group of subjects, a limited number of subjects, which is of course a problem in terms of statistics and representation of data. And they also require an elicitation of very controlled materials, as I mentioned during the presentation, and at least to start with. So the results are difficult to generalize, but they rather may work if they are used to investigate the single subject conditions and strategies, which in any case should be taken into account. So thanks a lot for your attention, and I hope I was clear enough.
Yes, it was very clear. Thank you very much, Professor Gili-Fivela. Now let's hear from Waldemar Ferreira Netto and Marcos Martins. Waldemar Ferreira Netto is full professor in philology and Portuguese language at University of São Paulo. He has long-term work on phonology and prosody. In the last decade, he has been working in the Prosody project, which proposes to develop an automatic analysis of intonation aimed to characterize different emotions, speech styles, genders, among others. More recently, Waldemar Netto is applying Prosody methods to characterize the speech produced by patients with schizophrenia. Marcos Martins is doctor in philology and linguistics in University of São Paulo, and he develops researches on phonetics and phonology, especially on the perception and production of prosody. Recently, he is carrying out a postdoctoral research in which he collaborates with Ferreira Netto in the Prosody project to develop a protocol to analyze the speech of patients with schizophrenia. So I'll pass the word to Waldemar and Marcos.
Hi, Bruno. Thank you for inviting us, and thank you, Abralina, also. It's a pleasure to talk about prosody and phonetics and pathology also. Well, I will share my screen so we can begin from the beginning. Here. Well, as you said, this work is an ongoing project that done by Waldemar and me as his assistant. This presentation is the new develops that we did in the past 2 years. The title is Speech Intonation in Schizophrenia, Principles for an Automatic Analysis. Well, I will try to talk about a little bit about schizophrenia and prosody, also automatic analysis of intonation, what we think about automatic analysis of intonation, and about our ongoing research. Well, let's talk a little bit about schizophrenia. I would like to say that I'm not a medical doctor, so I will say just what we know. Well, schizophrenia is a complex heterogeneous behavior and cognitive syndrome. It's a mental disorder. It's a major mental disorder with large symptomatology. Well, there's a lot of symptoms to categorize to diagnose schizophrenia. Major symptoms in literature are delusions, hallucinations, disordered thinking. Other symptoms are flat affected, social withdrawal, apathy, and among others. Well, as I said before, there is a lot of symptomatology. There's a lot of symptoms to describe schizophrenia. There is no absolute consensus. It's in ongoing discussion, I think, in medical literature. But these are the most common to appear in literature. So several factors contribute to the risk of developing schizophrenia: genetics, environmental, and brain structure and function. However, there is no clear definition of the causes either. Well, they discuss how the schizophrenia develops in some people and not in others. So it's a very medical discussion also. So onset occurs in early 20s to mid 30s. It was a very early disease. People develop the symptoms in the final 10s, between 18 to 25, more or less, you say. About 1% of the world population is affected by schizophrenia. And according to data in Brazil, only 0.25% of the population is properly diagnosed, which means there is a lot of non-diagnosed or misdiagnosed. That's including a major problem for the health and care here in Brazil. So language is a major sign because there is no objective test, there is no clinical test. You have to do some clinical observations of the patients. And language is a major sign because you can see something is not doing very well. I mean, you have some language deviations, and it gives the idea that we are doing with some disease. Well, so the symptoms related to language is disorganized speech, usually described as lengthy, with no flat affect, with flat intonation, with many neologisms, illogical constructions, loose associations, punning and rhyming. This two, punning and rhyming, it's not very. There's no too much example. It's one or other, but the patients usually try to speak with some try to do words based mainly in phonological shape, not in the semantic content. That's one of the discussions appears in literature. So it becomes illogical construction, loose association, it's analogism, and so on, and the speech becomes disorganized. That's one major observation about schizophrenic language and speeches for schizophrenia patients. Well, according to Mitchell et al., I forget, it's in Portuguese here, I'm sorry. Schizophrenia affects 4 major linguistic functions: pragmatic, speech, acts, and intentions. So, for example, if you say, could you please pass me the salt? They say yes. They don't understand indirect question. I mean, some of the patients, not all the patients. Intentions, inference, and reference. So there is a lot of discussion about the developing the meaning, understanding in context. The use of pronouns appears to be more or less different or deviant for what we do, what verbal person does, health controlled person does. And in discourse, when I talk about discourse, I'm talking about how the conversation flows, about the flow of conversation. So schizophrenia patients don't keep it in one topic. They jump to one topic to other. So talking about a lot of topics with no concentration, with no one with only one topic, but there's a lot. And this kind of problem involves the insertion of the context. I mean, they can put, or better say, the context is always missing in the conversation. The context is not always a part of the conversation. Here again, not all of them, but in some cases. And prosody, when we talk about prosody, mainly we talk about affective prosody, the prosody association with emotions, of attitudes, not the linguistic prosody to differ topic and phrasing or boundaries or something like this. So there is a lot of discussion about this question of prosody, and it's our main interest in here. So, well, the prosody in schizophrenia has more and long pauses and hesitations than normal speech. Also, flattened intonation, it's a common negative symptom called sometimes aprosodia. That's a very fruitful discussion in literature, because we can see this kind of characteristics, but we can also not see it. Depends on how you collect the data, how the data is organized, what's the method involved. So there's a lot of discussion about it. But I think pauses and hesitations is one point that many authors talk about this. Flat intonation is more or less related with negative symptoms. So symptoms in schizophrenia is divided in two: negative symptoms and positive symptoms. Flat intonation so is associated with negative symptoms. It means less functions, linguistic functions, cognitive functions, and things like that. And this is called prosodic, but this is not always. It's a term used by Ross and Compton to explain this kind of thing. But flat intonation is also used. Flat effect. There's a lot of concepts to explain this kind of phenomenon. Well, according to the literature and the reviews, schizophrenia patients have significant impairments in topicalization and discursive distinction. So John went to supermarkets, not to the grocery store or to the house. This kind of task is performed worse by schizophrenia patients than normal health controls. Another point is phrasing. This is a very complicated question because phrasing is a very intricate question in prosody. So they say they can't do the phrasing all the time. The patients go to one phrase to other without mark this changing. So here is what phrasing is. It's also this kind of problem we have to discuss more in question of prosody. Well, emotion and attitude recognition using prosody looks like is a problem also. Looks like schizophrenia patients can always understand it, but it's controversial. Results indicate both ways, but appears that some groups are not able to recognize emotion and attitudes. And production of effective speech prosody. So they can code emotions in prosody, or they can, it's a very hard thing, but appears that sometimes speech prosody is not appropriately coded to express some emotion or attitude. Well, this kind of less things, though, I mean, this impairment appears to be connected to negative symptoms. That's one major discussion. So there's other groups of patients who will not show this kind of variation, and that's a very important discussion for us to follow in medicine literature. But it's not, it's an ongoing discussion in literature either. So, well, as I said before, perception and emotional distinction tests patients with schizophrenia perform worse than control. The same results as found in facial expression identification tests. So, appears that patients with schizophrenia has both problems to code emotional process and also decode it. Decoding the speech process connects to emotion. And we can come back to negative symptom and the question of flight effect, the not expression of emotion. So there is some questions in here also. Well, production is ambiguous. In literature, affective speech process shows some tendency to flight intonation. So persons who has these negative symptoms, they appear to not make F0 variations or pitch variations as much. But otherwise, the structural prosody has some regular intonation, even hyperprosody. That means they can do some changes in, they are doing the changes in regular linguistic dysfunction like phrasing or focus or distinctive tasks, and not in speech emotional speech. But again, there is, it's ambiguous, not clear about it. Well, so just to make a summary about this, intonation in schizophrenia has major questions to be answered, not by us, not only by us, by the medical doctors either, because we don't fully understand how it works, but we have some sense that F0 has a little bit, shows a little bit of less variation than the normal health control. That's one great discussion. And but to say there is monotonous or atonous or without proposal is a question to be developed in further detail. So I will talk about what we're doing with automatic analysis and come back to the results. Well, our work is based in these 5 steps. We start with linguistic hypothesis. All the work is most in here because we have to do some observations, come up with the linguistic hypothesis, start with some analysis, and from this first analysis, we develop the prosodic parameters, so F0, tempo, intensity, all the prosodic parameters we can take it from this linguistic hypothesis and first analysis. We develop a mathematical model. Here is the part where we sit and see how these parameters correlate with the linguistic hypothesis, the analysis. We develop the application. The application does data analysis of data, and we see if it fits with our linguistic hypothesis, or if you don't share, we have to change the parameters or change the application. We go back to see what's going on. So it's more like this cycle we work in, Waldemar and I mainly, and Martin, of course. But really like to say that linguistic hypothesis is the core of the question. We began with, so how works, for example, emotion in speech, and we start from there. We do not start from prosodic parameters or mathematical models. So we always have the linguistic hypothesis to start. Well, with this in mind, Waldemar started to work in this application, Prosody, is a computational application for automatic analysis of intonation. We have main functions. We've been working the past 10 years is pattern detection. So we try to detect oh, this is a sad speech or this is a happy speech using rules, statistical rules, by using patterns detection. And of course, it's not trying to develop a learning machine, but analytical machine, more or less. PB intonation modeling by perceptual rules. I worked with it in my master dissertation, trying to develop it on a way to explain how the intonation is perceived and how it's produced by the speaker. Waldemar works in the main core of this hypothesis, and I worked with the operation, with the I try to apply these ideas to see and define the perceptual rules. And we are trying to apply large analysis of large data sets. So we try to analyze a lot of data with this application to see if the pattern detection works fine, if the intonation modeling works fine. So we are developing this analysis all the time. Well, here comes the mathematics. So I'm sorry. We define intonation as a temporal series. That's important. That's a very tricky definition, because when you see something as a temporal series, you can analyze how it works in the past and how it works in the future, and you can analyze patterns. So, for example, weather is always a temporal series. So how we know will be raining or will, I don't know, be sunny, we know about using temporal series. So in this kind of work, we define each Z as a barrier intonation unit, because bears fundamental frequency and intensity. So Z1, Z2, Z3, Z4 is elements of temporal series. Here is a time 1, time 2, time 3, time 4, and goes on. I can see how Z1 is connected to Z2, how it's connected to Z3, how it's connected to Z3 is connected to Z1, and all this kind of links can be done using this kind of mathematics, using temporal series. Well, we can use this to make some componential analysis. What that means, we can analyze this as a timing working, accumulation of facts, and we can also say, well, this is one component, this is one part, this is another part, and so on. We can start to do some components to do a better analysis of what it's looking for. So we have three great components in our analysis: average tone and super and inferior thresholds. I will try to explain it in further detail. Average tone is a mathematical component which emulates the speaker's tendency to keep the fundamental frequency in a central range. So the main idea is we have the speaker is producing F0, so it goes in a area, and if it goes beyond if it goes beyond this area, it can becomes meaning for it can be meaningful for the listener. So this is the other two components: the superior and inferior thresholds, defined by perceptual analysis in 3 and -3 semitones from mean tone and average tone. So this blue line is the average tone, and here is the EF superior, here is the EF inferior. So this is the superior threshold and inferior threshold. If 0 goes inside this area, around the average tone, we don't have any perceptual variation to the listener. We define this using perceptual tests. But if F0 goes beyond these limits, it becomes more meaningful to the listener. But it's language dependent. So in Portuguese, the test shows a more certainty for -3 semitones, but +4 and +3 is fuzz. For some persons perceive in -3 and +3, others in +4. So it's fuzz, but +3 is very significant. So we took this as example. So as I just said, beyond the thresholds, beyond the thresholds, the tonal difference become more perceptible. So it was defined as focus superior and focus inferior using these equations in here. Well, I'm not talking about the mathematics, but this is how we define the average tone, and this is how we define these thresholds from average tone either. Well, going on. So another thing that we started to work in the past years is about phrasing. We set these 3 parameters to work, and it's an ongoing work either. If there is a pause more than 500 milliseconds, it's a boundary. It's a boundary. You can see that's another phrase. If there is any fundamental frequency shift of more than 3 semitones and it keeps it, so the speaker is talking in this area and go beyond the threshold, if it keeps in here, so we may have another phrase. Or if he goes beyond in here also, in this any threshold. If there is a fundamental frequency shift, but it's not and it not maintains it goes beyond this limit, insert a little pause of 250 milliseconds, it's also a boundary. Well, as I said, this is an ongoing work, so we're trying these parameters. We are trying to do some perceptual tests or things like that to make the adjustments. It comes to automatic analysis, we define the acoustical parameters. Now we're doing analysis and we have to go back to our linguistic hypothesis to see if it works. Well, moving on, here is the output. Here's what we get with this kind of analysis. We have in here, I'm sorry, I think it's very light, but this line is the blue and green line are the average tone. This gray line and this another gray line is the thresholds, and this line with the green points is the F0. Here we have a pause of marked with this blue asterisk, and here another pause. So we have 3 phrases in this location, in this U-turns. So we have here two major pauses, And here, I'm sorry, I can see, but there is a well, it's not clear for me, but so I'm sorry. And here you have a finalization. So the F0 goes all the way down from the beyond the thresholds and finish the utterance. So this is one result we got from this kind of analysis. As I said, this is ongoing research. We are doing all of the things to improve it, so any suggestions, comments will be very helpful. So I will present some results. I'm sorry. I present some results about schizophrenia doing this automatic analysis that we are proposing. This work becomes because me and Waldemar, we are trying to do some pattern detection of emotions, and we have this schizophrenic patients' speech samples, and we use it as a to see how it works in the middle of emotions. We knew about the question of there is no F0 variation. The F0 variation is less than the health people. So we did this analysis just to check if it works. Well, the results we found was schizophrenic patients has a lower F0 value, so they have a pitch range more lower pitch range, but they use less variation of F0, so fundamental frequency. There's a low dispersion of positive variations of focus and emphasis. What that means, they don't pass too much from these superior thresholds. They stay more or less in the average tone or goes to the inferior threshold. That's one thing that appeared. The lower mean interval between bearing unit intonation units. So the intonation units are more close for them than for the health control, or better say, for the active speech we analyzed. I'm sorry, I forgot to say, was an angry, neutral, and sad example. So acted by actress. So and there is a lower mean interval between these units, a lower mean, which means that these intonation units are more close for them than for the emotional speech. This is a dendrogram we use to show it. I presented this in, I don't remember when, but you can see here, there is a tendency to this group, the schizophrenic patients, so patients with schizophrenia, to be grouped together here would indicate more or less they are different as a group from the other speech samples. So there is no totally agreement between angry, neutral, and sadness, but there is an agreement between the schizophrenic speech or the data from schizophrenic. But there was a preliminary study where we did that as a test for trying to see how it works in our automatic analysis. Well, in a second work, we tried to do some entropy analysis. Entropy analysis is how pitch or how F0 is handled, the pitch handledness. So we have these thresholds, the superior and inferior thresholds. We have this average tone, and we evaluate how F0 works in these 3 dimensions. So it is they goes all the way, or it follows some I don't know, some pattern. We took this idea from channel And it's a very common idea in physics, Brownian movement. So how a particle goes in the liquid, how two masses go together. So it's not new, it's a question for physics and communication. We took a personal story with emotional background. So we asked to patients in health control to tell us a story, a sad and a happy story about his life. We didn't evaluate if it was sad or happy. We just asked them for do this, and the results was kind of not so what we expected, but only we analyzed 9 parameters and only 2 has a statistical difference: target and final vowel extension. So I'm sorry, we analyzed the boundaries. We took the boundaries of the phrases and we analyzed these boundaries. And we see again that patients with schizophrenia has a lower F0 variation, either in this case, using entropy analysis. We're trying to do this entropy analysis again and again. The results appears that when we analyze these patients with schizophrenia in health control groups, we see that there is a little tendency to be a little bit hands-on. There is entropy is more close than 1. That's the mathematician question in here, but it's an ongoing research here. Well, that's our ongoing research that we are doing in the past years, and we are trying to develop this better. We took 14 patients with schizophrenia and 14 males have control, and the task was tell a personal story. With no emotional background, they just tell a personal story. The data was used in 2 different studies, so the story system also changed from one group to another. Well, we analyzed from this average tone and this EF superior and EF inferior. So we took the 2 thresholds and divided in 5 levels plus the 2 beyond the threshold. So we have 7 levels. And we counted how many times F0 go inside every level. So we have 5 levels inside the thresholds from every tone and 2 more outside. And just make a simple count. The results was, as you can see here, schizophrenia patients has a little bit more concentration of F0 production in the level 2 and 3, more close to average tone, and has less production of 0 in F in inferior and superior. So the lighter blue is control group, and the darker blue is the schizophrenia patients. So that's just a sum. So I just made a total of occurrences. So was not any statistical analysis very profound. So we can see the level 2 and level 3 has more incidence of F0 than the higher and lower levels. Well, I'm sorry, I forgot to say, this is how much F0 occurrences you get from schizophrenia patients and how much we take from the control group. It's like 5,000 and a half, more or less. We took also the mean in every single level. We can see there is the same results. There is a little more concentration here for schizophrenia patients in central levels, and a less concentration of F0 and the extremes. This is a ongoing analysis also, but we took the mean variation. I took the mean and I make the difference from every X point from the mean. It's more or less a distance which the point it's divided is distant from the mean for every level. As you can see here, over again, there is a difference between schizophrenia patients and control group and central level. So they keep more or less in the mean, but in inferior level, there is almost the double. So in case there is a real difference in here, then here either you can see this kind of difference. Well, level 1 and level 5 and 4, there is no mean difference. We are trying to understand why. And I did a squared sum of this distance either. So I took this distance from the mean, and I took elevate to square and make an analysis. Again, we have patients, schizophrenia patients with a large concentration in the central levels, with less variation, with a less concentration in inferior and superior levels. So this is what the results so far we could take it. Oh, I forgot to say that all the analysis was made using automatic analysis. So we run the application in the audio and took this kind of data. Well, here is a dendrogram also to see if there is any possible aggregation, and we see the control group works as a group, the patients works as a group, but the patients level 2 and 3 appears to be excluded group, a unique group. That's a very intriguing question to us for now. So they appear to works different from the other data, but we don't know why this happened. We have to investigate. And the same we can see here in inferior to the normal, to the health control people. So we have to understand why these two things happen in here. It's our next tech analysis. So what just said, the dendrogram analysis indicates clear separation between groups. Also demonstrated tendency for as a central levels to be grouped in an exclusive group. That's the problem we found and the question should be answered. So the results we find so far indicates level 2 and 3, and the emphasis, the level inferior is significant, statistically different from each group. So indicates schizophrenic patients and health control patients, they have these three level different. And L5 is fuzzy, sometimes is different, sometimes it's not. So it's a question to be developed in the next steps. Quantitative analysis, as I just said, indicates that schizophrenic patients concentrate F0 production in central levels, mainly L2 and L3, with little concentration in low and higher levels. So they keep it almost closed of average tone of this or component average tone. They keep it in line with average tone. And control group use all the levels, but there's a difference in how they use L5 and L-imp. So this is the statistical analysis. We don't understand why this happened so far. We have to do some tests, more tests. So my final remarks, as with the results we find so far in here with this tree analysis indicates a tendency for less F0 variation in schizophrenia patients, especially in low and high frequencies. What that means? They keep it in central tendency, statistical central tendency to be analysis again. So we did not evaluate F0 variation on the central levels. We did not did this is the next step. We have to see, we want to see how its F0 goes from this mean, how much it goes, if it goes for any direction. And the next steps also involve qualitative analysis of these 5 levels and adjust. So 5 is enough, we have to have 10 or 8, or it's an open question for us. Analysis of emotive speech sample for both groups, but it's pretty much hard to have emotional speech from patients with schizophrenia because the collected, it's a control collected. And we want to do some preliminary automatic analysis, is assuming a hypothetical difference between level 2 and level 3 and EF-INF. So we will do a blind analysis, trying to say, well, this is from a schizophrenic patient, this is not. So this is the next step we're trying to work or to do. So that's it. Thank you. I hope I have been clear.
Yes, thank you very much, Marcus and Waldemar. Now we have approximately 20 minutes for questions, and I'll start by asking the same question to everyone, so maybe you can answer it in the same order of the talks. The question is, what are the main open questions in your research topic that needs to be addressed in order to have a better understanding on the way that the disease interferes on the verbal expression of the patients? An example of open question could be, for instance, the relation between a particular aspect of cognition and the disease that you study. And also, what kind of advances, technical, methodological, or theoretical advances are needed to answer properly those open questions? So, anyone would like to?
Do I have to start with that?
Yeah, if you want to.
Oh my gosh, that's huge. Well, I would, in terms of the work we've done on Parkinson's and what it's revealed to us, I don't know if I've captured all of the facets of your question, but to me, in terms of prosody, it's clear that it's the more socio-emotional meanings that seem to be problem, and using nonverbal and verbal cues to understand more complex social intentions of another person. This is the direction we need to go. So at the beginning, we were just looking at these very isolated, unnatural types of stimuli that might have conveyed certain emotional cues or linguistic cues. This is not the way we speak to each other. And we need to draw off pragmatic information, and we need to use nonverbal cues and language in a very complex way to when we interact. And this is exactly what I think could be problematic for individuals with Parkinson's, who we've learned over the last couple of decades have various types of cognitive issues. And so it's as aspects of their cognition are decreasing, it's affecting social communication. And so we need to do more research on different aspects of pragmatic competence. So it's really the area of pragmatics is the short answer, I would say, that we need to delve into. Yeah.
Yes, thank you very much. Barbara?
Well, I think, prosody, it's a big issue, and well, for me, it's prosody in relation with the linguistic message a lot. So there is still much to me to understand about the discrepancies in Parkinson's versus controls production in terms of the production of the linguistic message, meaning different types of accents or different type of patterns that may express different meanings, and how much the variation that we can observe in Parkinson speakers modulation of prosody may impact on the comprehension of the message. And actually, well, the boundary in between, the boundary with pragmatics is really, subtle, and so that there is a very wide world behind it. And also, I think it would be, and I agree with Marc Pell in this, it would be very interesting, but again, from a linguistics perspective, even to start with, quite strictly, also to look at multimodality, because what I was observing about the lip gestures for the production of vowels, it's also very interesting for the, let's say, the conveying of the message, for instance, related to the articulation of a question rather than a statement. So when working on like healthy subjects, we could see that there is a strong interference of multimodal information and visual information in particular on the interpretation of the message, meaning interpretation of a question rather than a statement. So quite important information. So it would be interesting to see how Parkinson speakers convey this information, and which are the problems related to the interpretation of their production as well. But again, in linguistic terms, in my view.
Yes, thank you. And Marcus?
Well, I think the main question for us is about the pathology. So I think that's not a question for linguistics, but the medical area, about how schizophrenia works, its origins. There is difference between groups. I think when you go to medical literature, we see a lot of discussion about it. So we can have two kinds of data, because you have two kinds of schizophrenia patients. That's a major question. I think for us as linguists, not as, I think that's not a major question for doctors all the time. But I think that this is one of the major questions. The other major question, and I think that's a methodological issue, is there is no clear definition about how intonation differs from schizophrenic patients from normal, for health control groups. So because there is a lot of methods to collect the data, to analyze, to make the data analysis. So as you know, it's not that clear. It's not that clear with the difference between there's no one. There's not one definition. Oh, it's all the time with no prosody. It's all the time with no F0. Even prosody depends on definition and so on. I think to the second question, the main change we did is when we analyze, when we do a global analysis with all the data, with all the utterances, we have one result. When we go to do some local analysis, we have other results. So, for example, in the second research we did not find so much difference because it was a local analysis. When you go to global analysis, you see a lot of difference. So I think our hypothesis changed because we changed the way we see that. We go to global and local analysis, with interchanging between these two dimensions. I think is the answer I have for now.
Yes, yes, thank you very much. Now I'll ask something delivered by the public. This is a question to all of you as well. It's a question from Lais Bocorni, which is, I would like to ask you three to talk about the relation between linguistics and health sciences in your countries, please. How has the dialogue have been? Anyone would like to to start giving some thought on that?
Do you want to begin, Barbara, or?
Maybe this time I go first.
Okay, perfect.
Okay. Well, I think it's, well, if we start talking about education, because I think the communication starts there, maybe it's getting better because, for instance, it's quite recent a change that the Italian ministry approved about the insertion of linguists, I mean, glottology and general linguistics as a topic for people in, studying logopedics. So I think this is a signal of an improvement. And then other signals can be the fact that, well, it happens that linguists may be invited in, well, maybe not conferences, but in courses to update medical doctors. So at least we exchange our points of view on the same topics, and sometimes it's quite difficult to find the common ground because it may be not easy, but I think there are quite nice signals in that directions. But at least from my perspective, which may be not ideal, I mean, I'm not probably, well, I may not have the widest overview on the matter, but I think it's getting better, at least, well, it always depends on the starting point, but yeah, it's getting better, I think, in Italy.
Yeah, thank you.
You're welcome.
I guess I would say, so I had a distant training in linguistics, but I long diverged away and just sort of went into cognitive science and take a more psychological perspective. But I am actually in the Faculty of Medicine. I'm in the speech therapy department at McGill, which is within sort of the medical side of things. So I don't identify as a linguist, so I can't really tell you exactly how it is, but I do know that our national funding councils have many programs now that try to promote interdisciplinarity. So I think you see that increasingly, and trying to look at interactions between social sciences and the health sciences. So I don't think I'm giving this could just be my perspective, but I have a feeling that they're creating more opportunities for these types of collaborations.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And Marcos and Waldemar.
Well, I think here in Brazil, we have a good relation with health science, mainly because the speech therapists go all the time to linguistics departments to do some researches. I myself have a lot of colleagues who was speech therapists. So I think it's a good relation. I think there is a lot of work in doing by linguists and speech therapists. There is a lot of work in speech questions. And well, I don't know how it works in medical schools, but I know that speech therapists, it's very, very integrated with linguistics in the past 10 years. So on.
Yeah. Okay. There is a question by Alessia Guida that was originally that she posted during the Marc Pell talk, but I think it could also be extended to everyone, which is, did you notice some difference between how men and women with Parkinson's disease were rated by listeners? Did you investigate gender aspects?
That's a very interesting question. And so I'm thinking specifically, I don't know if the questioner had this in mind. It was the social impressions that people have of when people speak with Parkinson's. And in fact, we have not been able to tease that apart, but there is data in the literature on that. And it suggests there's a very important gender bias. And in fact, individual women with Parkinson's disease, I think, have an even stronger negative bias because of the impressions that are made about the way they talk and society's expectations about how a woman is supposed to express themselves. So they are often stereotyped as assumed to be more expressive. And so in fact, the changes and the limitations in their expressiveness actually penalizes. There's a stronger negative bias against women. And this is not work that we've done, but there are several studies in the last 10 years that show this gender bias.
Yes, and the others have observed gender bias in their own research?
If I may, I mean, I didn't have a chance. I haven't had a chance because we only investigated males, and further we were not looking at those aspects. So, I mean, I could only go back to the literature, as Marc Pell already said.
Yes, and Marcos?
Well, we did not in gender analysis so far, but I know schizophrenia has a gender bias from beginning. There's more male patients than female patients, so it can be one question to be pursued in intonation.
Yeah. So Maria de Fátima de Almeida Bahia asked Barbara, she said, my question is regarding the non-standard movement patterns that are not necessarily dysfunctional movement patterns. For instance, I have observed children and adults with cerebral palsy discovering ways of using their available dynamic resources in movement patterns that are mechanically sound and metabolic economical, speech articulation and body movements as well. How did you differ the speech's individual variability from general aspects related to his impairment?
Well, okay, I also think they were not dysfunctional. So they were done on purpose, or maybe not so consciously. I mean, at least what we were looking at, what we could find. But they were, at least as far as we understood, they were gestures different in order to compensate, in order to, I mean, hopefully optimize the speech output, because the speech output is due to many variations in the vocal apparatus. So I don't think they were dysfunctional in this respect, but they were functional to obtaining a better output. So the way we tease apart, well, that's a good question. We try to use the repetitions. We cannot work on many subjects, as I said, at least on this articulatory data. And so what we try to find is patterns within each single subject in order to understand how the single subject works. And so in this respect, we use repetitions. So we ask to repeat a number of times, of course, randomly. So you don't do that like straight in a row, but you repeat the same target for 7 or even more times over the entire corpus. And we try to go through the data and to see whether there are, like regularities that we can try to understand as patterns that the speakers are using to achieve a goal, rather than something that just they cannot control because it's due to the disease.
So thank you. Now we have only 5 minutes left, so I'll read the last question. It's a question also from Maria de Fátima de Almeida, Bahia, to Marcus and Waldemar. She asked, did you compare patients suffering with persecutory delusions, such as patients with paranoid schizophrenia, with the ones who were not suffering from this? In general, the ones who believe that they are being persecuted tend to use a different rhythm, speed of speech. And she completes, from the observations I have made in my music therapy sessions with blind people who suffer with schizophrenia. This is a very interesting question also for me, because me myself study schizophrenia, and so far in the literature I haven't found any alterations in prosody associated with positive symptoms, only to negative symptoms. And it's very interesting for me here that paranoid schizophrenia patients do present this kind of discrepancy. So Marcus and Waldemar, have you been able to notice this correlations?
Well, thank you for the question. We did not evaluate this difference, but really there is no, I didn't see any literature or analysis saying doing some positive symptoms analysis, but it's very intriguing. We can discuss this in further detail because it's very interesting.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Okay. And very lastly, the very last question: did you use the same parameters to analyze the relation between prosody and emotions in typical and atypical speech? This is a question by Franciele Mar to Marcus and Waldemar also.
Well, thank you again for the question. Yes, we did an analysis, the same parameters in the both groups. So was the group analysis of F0 variation, like mean, median, standard deviation, was basic statistical analysis, not very profound or complex.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so unfortunately it's time to finish. I really would like to thank you all for having accepted the invitation, but mostly for having given this wonderful talks. It was very inspiring for me hear about your works and the kind of problems that you are dealing with. And I hope you can continue to talk about these subjects on other occasions. So thank you very much. And I recommend everyone to have a look on the Abralinha ao Vivo website to see what are the other talks that will be occurring on the following days. And stay home, stay safe. And goodbye, everyone.
Goodbye. Thank you to you.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye, and good luck to all of us.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you very much.
Bye.
Thank you.